again, at its worst, which I think is quite different from the basic conception of what financial markets are there for than in Hong Kong. And I'm perhaps comparing with Hong Kong at its best with the mainland at its worst. I would say that I don't see capital account convertibility happening for another decade. And until that happens, I think the kind of convergence that international markets force on domestic markets is unlikely to happen. I think that is probably the experience of looking at Taiwan in terms of you certainly have a class of super companies which are very good. And then if you look below that, in terms of perhaps the quality of firms, you would sit behind a domestic shield, you would remain a sort of a punter's market, you would, so I think there'll be big differences for appreciable time.
At the moment, the major problem in China is precisely the corporate governance of state-owned enterprises. The problem, there are a number of problems with the state-owned enterprise. One is the lack of control by the owner, the controlling owner being the state, but the state doesn't have a presence. So the state doesn't really control the manager, and the job of supervising the manager is given to the board of supervisors. But unfortunately, the supervisors do not have adequate powers under the company law, under the present company law, to monitor the manager. Although there are changes being considered under the proposed amendment, whether they will be adopted or not, we'll have to wait and see. Also, the supervisors are nominated by the board of directors or the manager, although appointed by the shareholders. And therefore, the supervisors do not always feel that they are at liberty to challenge or supervise the manager. So the system of supervisors doesn't work very well. And as a result, you have a vacuum. The state doesn't control the manager, the board of supervisors cannot control the manager effectively. So there have been a lot of examples of asset stripping, for example, by the managers of state-owned enterprise. They can set up a company, they own themselves and sell the productive line of the state-owned enterprise to the company they own. The shareholders, the minority shareholders that holds less than 25% of the shares in the state-owned enterprise do not have legal rights to bring actions against the wrongdoing managers. There isn't a clear provisions in the company law that gives them the right to bring actions. Again, this is now in a pipeline. There's been proposal to give shareholders a right to bring derivative actions as well as a direct actions against wrongdoing manager.
I think generally speaking, and I think the common wisdom is that corporate governance standards in China are lower than obviously the other countries. But given the background of China and how far it's come, it's actually, I would say, is not something that you can be you can point a finger at China and say that you guys are bad guys. I think it's just a matter of how quickly they've had to ramp up in terms of the way the business have developed. And I think, in fact, I think they're probably ramping up faster than most Western countries or Hong Kong. We've had a much longer history of development of these kinds of corporate governance standards, and they've had to do it almost literally overnight. But to the extent that, as I said earlier, to the extent that a lot of them be looking for a listing in places outside of China, and China's own regulatory framework is being set up by people who obviously know what the best standards are, okay, then I think China will learn even quicker. And I think there's a need, of course, for enforcement. It's no use. I think nobody drafts bad laws or bad regulations, but there's a need for enforcement and enforcement at the local level, where the companies are actually situated. In that extent, I think China has actually made very bold moves. As you know, China has actually hired in experts from outside of China to sit on their own regulatory, agencies, and I think they'll continue to do that. And I think China is certainly making all the right moves and making the right kind of regulatory framework moves that would allow them to bring in corporate governance in the correct way. But I think it's also education. It's education of not just the regulators, but also the people who manage companies. And it's education of the society in general as to what standards to expect.
As far as the corporate governance system or the models are concerned, certainly the mainland China, they have a much more sophisticated corporate governance structure when comparing to Hong Kong. But then that is structure, that's not substance, that's not the spirit. For example, company listed in the form of Asia, they have to report results on a quarterly basis. And when you look at their reported results, they have a very detailed breakdown regarding segment results and also detailing the operational results as well. So therefore, in terms of disclosure, practice, and also governance structure, and also board compositions, apparently there seems to be pretty much in line with the global standard, especially the US one. But then on the other hand, it is a public secret that we understand that the capital market in China is still at a very infant stage of development. It is not yet matured. So therefore, earning the trust from investor as to whether you have a very good implementation of the governance system is another thing. Having a system is one thing, but then how you're going to implement the system so that it helps you to drive towards achieving the ends is another thing.
The growing links between businesses, professional bodies like the Hong Kong Institute of Chartered Secretaries, and regulators in Hong Kong and China clearly have implications for corporate governance. Increasing numbers of mainland companies have been listing in Hong Kong and are subject to the full rigor of our listing rules. The Hong Kong Stock Exchange and the Hong Kong Institute of Chartered Secretaries have been involved in training programs for senior management of mainland firms. There has also been a growing exchange of financial professionals. In the following, we ask our guests what role Hong Kong is playing in the mainland's corporate governance development.
I think that's a very, very good issue because here again, a lot of Chinese firms have sort of listing here in Hong Kong itself. Culturally, we're closer to China. Physically, we're also closer to China. And so I think and our regulatory system does give assurance to some potential shareholder or investor that the firms listed in Hong Kong are well regulated. Of course, this brings up the other issue. If we're over-regulated, then of course the Chinese firms may seek listings elsewhere. For example, today, my understanding is that many foreign firms are shying away from the US ADR simply because of the Sarbanes-Oxley issue. So we don't want here in Hong Kong to get into a situation where a lot of foreign firms, particularly PRC firms, shy away from us.
Very much so. I think Hong Kong has a very important and actually pivotal role to play in helping the future shaping of the whole capital market in China.